Welcome to Lesson 8 in Making It Meaningful, Transition Assessment for Students who are Deaf and Lower Functioning. I'm Professor Greg Long at Northern Illinois University, and this work was sponsored by the Texas Educational Agency, as well as great support from Teresa Johnson and Susie Tiggs. In this particular segment, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what should be included in a report. And I'll be honest with you, it's a little bit challenging to talk about this because the report really is going to vary based upon, what it's done, what the purpose of it was, and so forth. So I'm going to give you some broad general parameters to work with, but these should be things that, particularly within a school setting, that most school-based evaluations should have. Now, we'll go from there. As we talk about it in any sort of report, and this is not just as it relates to deafness, these are things that if you're evaluating, looking at any type of psychological assessment-based report, these are the things that should be included, right? So you should always have some identifying information, who is the person, age, birth date, so on and so forth. Then your referral question, and we'll talk more about the referral question in a moment, but the referral question should lay out why this particular assessment was done. Then your report is also going to have background information. Okay, so these are all parts of any report you might come to see. They'll also have a section typically called behavioral observations, which we'll talk about how did the child or student interact with the evaluator, what were the conditions of testing, what do we think about that? Then your next section would normally be what were the tests or procedures that were used to gather information, followed by the what's it mean, the scores and interpretation, followed by recommendations. Now, any individual evaluator may have a slightly different model than this, but these are the typical components that you would see in a traditional school-based report. Now, the one thing I would do is I'd like to mention a couple of what we might say additional deafness things to the report. I would always include these, and in fact, from a kind of how you might evaluate a report, if these things aren't in the report, that to me would be a very serious red flag. That would make me wonder, did the person who wrote this report have a full understanding of the disability? Because background information is not only where the person lives, it's not only, other kinds of things, but when it comes to disability, we need some additional information there. Because if you're saying, well, this individual was deaf, that tells me very little. I don't know what degree of loss they have. When did they become deaf? Why did they become deaf? Right? Those are things that have impact on a person's functional skills, as well as from a background. How about parents? Are they from deaf parents, hearing parents? Are the parents involved? Do they sign? And then also background information, was assistive technology used during the evaluation? In what manner? And in fact, even was an interpreter noted? And we'll see that included oftentimes under behavioral observations. So let me go back to this previous slide. And we talk about the background. These are points: the degree of loss, parents' hearing status, educational history, use of assistive technology. Those are all things that we wouldn't normally see in a typical evaluation, but if we're talking about a student who's deaf, those should be there. And then in that next section, that behavioral observations, and again, this is a major one. If it's not there, it's a red flag, seriously. And that is, and how did communication occur during the session, right? So, for example, I have over many, many, many years of taking lessons and working professionally. I can give a test and do it with sign language. I would not be talking at the same time, but I know sign language can communicate. But suppose I'm not that person, all right? Suppose I have to use an interpreter. Well, that's okay. I mean, it's not best, but it's second best. But that should most definitely be described within the behavioral observations. Or if you see something where they said, we wrote notes back and forth, again, that's a red flag because communicatively, note writing is not going to be a strength for many of these students. So again, from my standpoint, any report that's written on a deaf student, whether they're low functioning or otherwise, needs to include the additional information as far as background and also the behavioral observations. If those two sections aren't addressing deafness, from my standpoint, the rest of the report could be suspect. Okay, now as we move into this second segment, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of how the reports might vary. Because as we think about evaluating a report, and this is whether it's a standardized report or one that's more informal, more functionally based, but you always have to think about, so what's really useful and what's not? How can I take advantage of things? And I've referenced this, but I want to say it yet again. If you're looking at a report, and for example, the behavioral observations or the background information, if those don't address deafness, well, that's a flag. And another potential flag or something to have some concern about is if you get a report written on a student who's deaf and low functioning, and you don't know the evaluator, you don't know much about the program or anything like that, is that, how accurate is it? And you have to use that based upon your knowledge of the student and any prior results or assessments that might exist. So again, be cautious. Much like before when I talked about don't rely and don't make diagnoses on a single subtest. Same thing as it relates to thinking about evaluations. When you look at something that's already been written, do you know where it came from, and does it include everything we anticipate it should? Now, as far as organization, I've made this point throughout, structure and the referral question drives what you do. So a formal report is going to generate a more traditional kind of structure, much like I was showing you a few moments ago. The different components, you'll see that in most any traditional standardized kind of assessment report. Informal reports are much more loose. They really depend on how things are needed to be discussed. Now, in this next section, I'd like to talk about the idea of principles of good report writing. I've taught psychological and vocational assessment at the graduate level for going on 20 years at this point. So spend a lot of time trying to encourage students to write well and know how to communicate in a fashion that hits multiple audiences. So when we think about well-written reports, from a background, and this goes for those of you not only who are writing reports, but who are viewing and reading reports, because I want you to be able to look at a report and say, hey, wait, this is really good, or we have some problems here, there are some issues, and I want you to have that competence. So when you look at a report, here's some things just to kind of keep in mind that would be characteristic of a well-written report. And one is, did they use multiple sources of data? If I read a report and it's written based on only one test, for example, that's problematic. That's potentially a concern for me. When I look at a report, does it include only that information that's really relevant? I've certainly worked with one psychologist in particular, I remember way back when in my earlier days, who had, you'd put in the scores and it would have a computer program that did an automatic report generator. And his reports would generate 20 to 30 page reports. Now, from my standpoint, I thought it was really fairly inappropriate, some might even say bogus to do that, particularly because they weren't gone in and revised, reformatted, made specific to the child. And so it included lots and lots of information that I would consider to be irrelevant. So a well-written report not only uses multiple sources of data, but it has information in it that's relevant. And then the other point on this is when you're confident about things, say so. It's all right if you are confident about the results and what they mean, go for it. But what we have to do oftentimes, and I put these kind of caveats in my reports all the time, is the caution. Because sometimes you may well have to use a standardized test or may have to do some things that you're just not entirely confident of the results because of how you administered it, the nature of the test, whatever it might be. When that happens, that's in your report. It's important to say, you know what? I did this, I have some concerns, here are the scores, and typically then you add, and this is a minimal estimate of the person's functioning. Those are things that I would expect to find in a well-written report. A well-written report also addresses issues of readability, okay? It's one of the things sometimes that those of us with the advanced degrees, we get kind of full of ourselves and we use really big language that unless you're writing to another psychologist or psychiatrist, sometimes the language doesn't make sense. I'm a big fan of writing for your audience. And so if I'm writing for people who aren't psychologists or psychiatrists, if I'm thinking of the general professional out there and educators and even parents, write at a level that they can understand, right? It's not an indication that I'm not smart and don't know the words. It's an indication that I recognize the importance of communication. Certainly the report should be logical, well organized. That goes without saying. Now, there's a point here that I've got on this slide that I'm going to take a brief tangent on, and it's called use person-first language. I mentioned that in the very first lesson when we talked about terminology, because as I said, having a brother who is deaf and multiply disabled, who definitely classifies as low functioning, there's a bit of it that hurts my feelings when I think of him as, oh, he's just low functioning deaf. Because David is so much more than that. He's a good brother, he's helpful, he's kind, he's got a number of interests, but classifying him by virtue of his disability isn't that great a thing. Now, that same concept exists across the board as it relates to disability. So I have a stepson, and my stepson has autism. Okay, and I can tell you all about him. He's wonderful, and has a job, he lives at home with us, and so forth, right? Now, so I have a stepson with autism. That gives you one image of him. Imagine if I said, oh yeah, my autistic stepson. That focuses your attention on the autism. So person-first language is this concept that to the extent we can, we don't focus just on the disability. We also try to minimize language that's negative or pejorative. So you're not confined to a wheelchair. You're not bound by a wheelchair. You use a wheelchair, right? You're not an invalid, right? You're not handicapped. Because handicap relates to barriers, it's not a personal issue. So person-first language, there are lots of resources out there. I encourage you to Google it and look at it. It's a way of speaking that not only for our students we're talking about now, but just in general, might seem a little awkward at first, but it puts you in the position, particularly from a professional standpoint, that you're not going to offend anyone. Whereas if you don't recognize these things, it's very easy to be offensive in how you use language. And then the last thing that I would mention about a well-written report is emphasize strengths and possible accommodations. One of the things I find as a teacher, as a professor, is that we are very, very focused on how to identify deficits, how to find weaknesses. I mean, if we think about assessment, that's where, at least historically, when I talk about with my students, they're focused on that. And yet in reality, we need at least equal, if not more, focus on strengths, things that we can build on. And that's an aspect of a well-written report, is not only a description of where the limitations are, but some description of strengths and accommodations. Okay, now, if we're moving on, you could make a checklist on this. I'm sorry I don't have one to have readily available for you just to hand out, but you could look at this as a template, right? So if you're evaluating a report, does it have the expected components? Does it have information, as I mentioned, regarding the deafness and how communication was accomplished during the session? And is there anything in there that says, hey, have some wariness with regard to scores because of administration, norm group, the things that we talked about? All those should be part of any sort of a standardized assessment report. If they're not, then that's an area where change can happen, where you can provide feedback. Now, if we think about it in terms of an informal report, and I did not give you a list of components of an informal report because depending on who's writing them, they differ greatly. I would say in an informal report, most certainly you'll have the identifying information, the referral question, who's involved, procedures, and so forth, but it's not nearly as laid out in terms of piece by piece. But if you think about it from a critique standpoint, this idea of a functional, ecologically based kind of assessment, the number one question was the question answered? Remember, the referral question drives the process. So whatever we're wanting to know, that organizes how we approach the problem. So if I'm going to read and review a report, certainly what I'm going to look at is, and did we answer the question? I'm also going to want to know who was involved, because if it's a report based on only parent report, but nothing from educators, nothing from other related professionals, that might be problematic. That might be a concern. As I look at the informal report, was there anyone missing? And again, going back to did the student have some input in this? Is this something that he or she, in whatever way they understand, can support? And, as I look at the report, do I have any additional questions? Or is there other information that I ought to have that I don't have? So those are some basic suggestions for how one might go about looking at an informal assessment critique. So in summary for this lesson, talked about critiquing assessments. We talked about first the idea of what you might find or what you should expect to find in a standardized assessment report, the structure, how it should look. And I emphasize that when you are critiquing those reports, the value, the significance of making sure that deafness is included within the report. It's not, I've seen reports where deafness wasn't even mentioned in the report, or it might have been mentioned as a recommendation, that, and because the student is deaf, they need instruction on, and yet it had been mentioned nowhere before. So again, your background information, behavioral observations within any report, whether it's a formal or informal report, need to include some description of how deafness impacts things. And then the final point I would say as we think about looking at these types of reports is as a consumer of the report, if you, not as the evaluator, but if you are the teacher, you're the vocational rehabilitation counselor, you're case manager, whoever you are, if you're reading the report, don't just accept it, all right? Review it, evaluate it, provide feedback. Use these criteria that we talked about, and does it meet your needs? Does it include the information? Because once it's written and once you accept it, it's in the file and it stays forever. So my goal on all of this is just to suggest there are ways that we can put this information together. There are certain deafness things that we need to include, but once done, please don't be hesitate to provide feedback. All right, that's it for this lesson. Thank you.